So, hello everyone, welcome. My name is Dora. I'm one of the organizers of Qesher. The other is Sebastian. You can find us both on the screen here. We started our initiative, this project called Qesher, which means connection in Hebrew. Soon 4 years ago, it was more or less 3.5 years ago, just in the beginning of the pandemic. And our aim was and has been to introduce Jewish communities from all over the world. And these are our regular sessions that we most of the time have on Thursdays and Sundays, in which we invite speakers to introduce their heritage, their Jewish communities' history and present day situation. The talk you're joining today is a little bit of a new series that we have, which is the Qesher Book Club, in which we introduce authors and books that are somehow connected and we feel that are important, just as important to introduce in our series. They always somehow speak about the Jewish communities in different places and how they are different but still similar, and they all have their own very, very interesting stories. Today we are very happy to welcome Josh Tuininga, who is an artist and author, and he published this very wonderful and very unique graphic novel that he's going to share with us today. What is the story behind it? How is the book? And he's also going to share with us a little bit about the Seattle Jewish community, where it also takes place. So we're very happy to have him here. The book's name is We Are Not Strangers. So I'm just going to pass the words to Josh to share with us about this book. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will have Q&A after his presentation. So Josh,
Great.
the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Dora, and thank you, Sebastian, also. Thanks so much for setting this up. Yeah, I'm so happy to be able to share the story with the Qesher community. So thanks so much for everybody for coming. So yeah, a little bit about me. I'm an author, artist, and designer living in North Bend, Washington, in the Pacific Northwest. And I went and studied art at the Art Institute of Chicago. And yeah, there I learned about fine art and stuff like that. And then eventually I started working as a designer. But as far as publishing goes, when my kids were born, I created a couple children's books. And then the story I want to talk about today is my first graphic novel, We Are Not Strangers. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with graphic novels, it's pretty much just a gigantic comic book. So yeah, I'm just here to talk about my new graphic novel. So let me get started by sharing my screen. Let's just take me 1 second. So and share screen. There we go. All right, does that look good? Great. So yeah, this project started in my Uncle Marco's West Seattle kitchen, which isn't too far from here, and he was making us, my family, his fresh caught fish and chips. And my uncle, as he cooked his dinner, he told us the story of his grandfather. I'm sorry, I got to make sure my slides are progressing here. There we go. His papu, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant from Turkey who arrived here in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s. And Marco went on to tell me about attending his papu's funeral. So it was a typical Sephardic Jewish event, close family, friends, relatives he hadn't seen in years, tons of familiar faces, but there were some people he didn't recognize at all. And a handful of Japanese American guests started to arrive, and no one knew who they were or why they came. And what Marco found out is that his papu had helped these families when they were forced out of the neighborhood and incarcerated during World War II. And so his story only took a couple minutes to tell me, but for the next few days, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I was asking myself, how does a Jewish immigrant with family still overseas threatened by the Holocaust end up helping out his Japanese American neighbors here at home? Did they stay in touch after the war? Were there other similar stories like this? So I had a ton of questions. So I went and back to interview my uncle Marco. This is a drawing of him. And together we started to do some research to see if we could find out more about the story. And we talked to our families and people from the old neighborhoods to see if we could dig up some details about his his papu's history and find out what happened. So I knew that Marco was named after his papu, Marco Calvo, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant. And his papu had spent the beginning of his life on the small fishing island of Marmara, but the region was becoming very unstable for Jews at the time in Turkey. And so Marco and many other Sephardic Jews came to America in hopes of a better life, and many of them arrived here in the Pacific Northwest. And so I went into the Ellis Island immigration database and found his official immigration documents from when Marco Calvo immigrated to Seattle in 1920. Kind of see his name there. And we knew that when he was young, he lived in the Seattle Central District, and he worked at Pike Place Fishing Market, which I'm going to get more into later. But at the time, the markets were primarily Japanese and Jewish owned. And we knew that Marco Calvo owned and ran the Ferry Dock Tavern at Pier 52 down by the waterfront. And we talked to several people who remembered him. So we were digging up a lot of vague details, and as the weeks went by, we weren't getting that far about all the, like the real concrete details. And, Seattle had changed a lot since the 40s, and the people who would have any more information about the story had died a long time ago. But I kept asking around, and as I talked to people, I kept hearing this name pop up in conversations, and they'd be like, "Have you talked to Devin Narr? You've got to go see Professor Narr at University of Washington." So I looked him up, and Devin he's the professor of Sephardic Jewish Studies here in Seattle at University of Washington, author of a ton of books about Sephardic Jewish history in Seattle. So I decided to reach out to him for help and get some advice from him. And he agreed to meet with me on campus. And that first meeting was when I realized that this project was a lot more, much more than just some family folklore. So Professor Narr started talking about the parallels between the Sephardic Jewish and the Japanese communities here in Seattle. And I started to learn about the Seattle Central District, which is a place where immigrants and minorities who were blocked from living elsewhere had an opportunity to get to know each other as neighbors and friends. And I started to learn about a lot of other stories about people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war. And so that first meeting with Devin, Professor Narr gave me a ton of resources, information, and a ton of homework. And yeah, so that when I first heard about this story, I thought it was a simple story about a Jewish guy who helps out his neighbor. Just a beautiful story. But once I started researching, it was clear that this story was about the type of environment that creates that kind of remarkable relationship. And so I discovered these maps of the Seattle Central District, which highlight just how unique of an area this was. So you can see so these maps are based on a house-to-house survey conducted in 1939. And you can see how there are concentrated neighborhoods, Sephardic Jews, Japanese. There are pockets kind of where people lived, and they all just kind of overlapped each other. So people of different backgrounds and cultures living right up against each other in this community. And I just wanted to take a minute to talk about Sephardic Jews. So a lot of people don't know that there are different Jewish cultures. I'm sure there's probably a handful of Sephardic Jews here. It'd be great to hear that in the chat. But so when most people think about Jewish culture, they think of matzo ball soup, speaking Yiddish. Those are Ashkenazic Jews, Jewish people originating from Central Europe and Eastern Europe. But Sephardic Jews come from Spain, Portugal, and the Middle East. And the fundamentals of Judaism are the same, but they have different customs and foods. And this is something I was really excited about representing in my story. So the main character of my story is based on my family history. So he's a Sephardic Jew from fishing islands in the Mediterranean. And when he arrives here in America, the U.S. immigration authorities don't really know what to make of this newcomer. So the Sephardic Jews arriving in the United States were unlike the other 2 million Jews who were arriving here from Eastern Europe at the time. These people did not speak Yiddish. Many of them did not look like the typical European Jews the officials were accustomed to seeing. And authorities referred to Sephardic Jews as, quote, a peculiar people. Other officials called them Turks of the Hebrew race, which I've kind of highlighted here on this page. And many were coming from the Far East region, and that was then considered part of the Orient. So they were also referred to with the derogatory term Oriental Jews. And that's something I had never even heard before starting this project. But as the Sephardic immigrants continued to arrive in America, they settled in cities all over the country, and Seattle became home to the second largest community of Sephardic Jews in the United States. Economic opportunities like the Great Northern Railway and the Klondike Gold Rush drew many Jewish people to the Pacific Northwest. And soon about 20% of Seattle's total Jewish population were Sephardic Jews, about 3,000 out of 15,000 by the mid 1900s. And a lot of Sephardic Jews who immigrated to Seattle found opportunities in the fish markets at Pike Place Market. And the market, established in 1907, was celebrated as the soul of Seattle, and many in the community called it a secular synagogue. So the National Register of Historic Places identified Sephardic Jews as like a key demographic in the market's history. So yeah, the Pike Place Market, fish markets were an opportunity to find work for Jewish immigrants who knew how to fish. And Pike Place Market was also a welcoming ground for the Japanese community. So the Japanese markets at Pike Place thrived before World War II. It's estimated that 4/5 of the fishermen and farmers selling produce at the market before the war were Japanese Americans. And so yeah, as I learned about this strong connection between the two cultures, fishing became a really big theme of my characters. But that wasn't the only thing these cultures had in common. So as I mentioned before, these cultures lived up against each other in the Central District, and yeah, it's just a high concentration of had a really high concentration of Jewish immigrants. The area gained the nickname Little Jerusalem at the time and became home to some of the first Sephardic synagogues in the country. And it was also the location of Nihonmachi, so that's Japantown, and that emerged as a residential, social, cultural center for the Japanese community. So yeah, this unique community was formed here where people from all these different backgrounds live closely together. And that can still be found today. There's a lot of that still there. So yeah, as I started to kind of dive deeper into this story and the history of the area, I started to think about my own memories from the growing from the CD. And so when I was a kid, we lived in the suburbs, but I used to tag along with my papu to the city to run errands all the time. And he loved to take me through the old neighborhoods and tell me old stories about growing up in the Central District. And we'd usually take a detour and grab some dim sum or cioppino at one of the fish markets. And he always seemed to know the owners. Like wherever we went, he always seemed to know everybody. And as a kid, I never really quite understood why we had to drive all the way into the city just to go to the bank or pick up some salmon for Passover. But looking back, I think he just really wanted to stay connected to the community there. He was from a family of Jewish immigrants, and most of his family overseas had been wiped out during the Holocaust. And the Central District was a place full of people with similar backgrounds, and he felt really comfortable there. So when I started this project, my papu, he wasn't around anymore, but I decided to do exactly what we used to do together. So I jumped in my car, headed to the city, and I started to do some exploring, and I started to do some drawing. And so here's my first sketch of the original Sephardic Bikur Cholim synagogue in the CD. And as I was coming across important landmarks and settings, I would snap a couple pictures, start sketching. And so this is the location of the real Ferry Dock Tavern, which the real Marco Calvo ran and owned. And this was a setting I used for a lot of my character scenes. And so the more I kind of immersed myself into these different environments, I was really able to solidify the setting of the story, and I could put important landmarks into the backgrounds of my scenes. So this is an important landmark. It's called Washington Hall. It was a historic public dance and music hall, which was the gathering place of a lot of, and settlement house for a lot of immigrant cultures. And so, yeah, so reference material was a big part of this process. And so that was the same when designing my characters. And so I looked at a lot of old pictures, some from old family photos and others I found from the time period, which I used to help, create the characters in the story. And I started using some of the information I was learning about where our family came from in my artwork. And I used a lot of old newspaper headlines to set the time frame of the story. As I was doing research, I'd try to get myself in the environment, and I'd research some old newspapers, and I just started using that for my character to read, to kind of orient the reader. And I used a lot of reference photos I found online. And as I started compiling images to draw for them, when creating these scenes, I used a lot of stuff I'd find online, but every once in a while I'd run into an idea for a pose for one of my characters, and I couldn't find a reference for it. So I couldn't like envision it in my head. So I'd have my family pose for me. And so I wanted to show a couple of these now, just to kind of give you a glimpse into, my process. My family is constantly subjected to me rushing into their rooms, interrupting whatever they're doing and forcing them to get into some strange pose like this. Um, I take their pictures to draw from, but a lot of times I'll come right back in, make them pose again from a different angle. And a lot of times, this is my daughter, Clara. The last one was Hazel, and then sometimes I'll make them use props. This is my wife. So they have no context for what's happening or why, but just want to show these as a little glimpse into my drawing process. Having live-in reference models is like makes my job a lot easier. So in the same way that I rely on reference material for my artwork, the same goes for creating the scenes and the storylines. So I really wanted all the things that happen to my characters to come from true stories or anecdotes that I pick up along the way in interviews and archives. And so one of the most valuable places for source material that I discovered through the whole process was densho.org. And so for those who don't know, Densho is a Japanese incarceration archive based here in Seattle. And this is where I started to learn about what happened to the Japanese community here in Seattle during the war. And so, um, for those of you who grew up here in the United States, I don't know how it was for you, but for me, I barely learned anything about this time period when I was a kid in school. I mean, I learned a lot about the Holocaust in Hebrew school and public school, but the incarceration camps were barely a blip on the radar in history class. And so one thing I didn't piece together for sure was before working on this project was, these events were happening simultaneously. And so the main character in We Are Not Strangers is faced with this dilemma. As a Jew, he's relying on the United States as an ally against the Nazis. But at the same time, his Japanese American friends and neighbors are being forced into camps right here in America. And so this is something I hadn't even thought about. And when I discovered the Densho archive, I started to learn a lot of things I hadn't heard before. And so I wanted to share a couple of those facts with you. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, 120,000 Japanese Americans were stripped of their rights and forced into camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. And most people lost everything, including property, possessions, businesses. 2/3 of those in prison were born. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard something. 2/3 of those in prison were born right here in America. They were native-born American citizens, and so not one prisoner was ever found guilty of any crime. And when the prisoners were released, they came home to virtually nothing, and they had to start their lives over from scratch. But there were these rare stories of people who did reach out to help, and especially in communities where people from different backgrounds got to know each other as friends and neighbors. And so there's stories of people who rented out their neighbors' homes for them and collected rent money to pay the mortgage, like in Marco's family story. And there are stories of people helping by keeping businesses afloat, storing people's possessions, caretaking properties, so that when their friends were finally released from camp, their neighbors still had something to come home to. And the more stories I heard like this and learned about, I could kind of weave them into my story with narrative and dialogue, and to create this historical fiction story. So I spent a lot of time on Densho, researching these stories, watching video oral history archives, getting source material and stuff like that. And eventually I decided to reach out to Densho and for some help, and they were absolutely amazing. So I worked with the historians and staff there, and they provided multiple read-throughs, gave me feedback, and pointed me in the different directions for different resources. So Densho was founded by Tom Makeda, who he wanted to document and archive, um, you know, and share World War II Japanese American incarceration history. So he conducted over 250 video oral history interviews. And there's one interview that I wanted to just kind of share with you. And it's the story of Aki Kurose. So if you're from Seattle, you might recognize her name. She was a well-known educator and peace activist, and Seattle Public Schools honored her by naming a middle school after her. And in 1941, she was a 10th grader at Garfield High School in Seattle. And that's when Pearl Harbor was bombed, which in this interview she recalls in great detail. And after the initial shock and chaos that followed, she remembers going back to school for the first day. She remembers walking into class her first day back, and one of her teachers, one of her favorite teachers, comes up, approaches her, and confronts her and says, "You people bombed Pearl Harbor." And Aki talks about how threatened she felt, and how up until that point she thought of herself as just a normal American kid, and she was popular, had tons of friends in the community, and suddenly she was thought of as the enemy. And this was one of the themes I really wanted to address in my book. I was asking myself, like, how does it possible that people's friends and neighbors in their own communities can so quickly change into becoming their enemies? And from what I've learned, this doesn't just happen out of the blue. So the media and and politicians can promote this climate of fear and misinformation. And we all know that sensational news sells. And during times of conflict, the narrative of dehumanizing these groups of people and making them seem dangerous can spread really, really quickly. And these messages can be so powerful that it makes it really, really hard for people to go against that. And that's why it's so rarely we hear about the stories like this of people who did reach out to help. But one of the things they talk about at Densho, especially, and in other communities, is the idea of bystanders and upstanders. And so the character in We Are Not Strangers is an upstander. He goes against what he's being told and reaches out to his friend, finds out how he can help, and works with him to create a plan, right? And this takes a lot of courage and compassion. Most people, however, including myself, sometimes are bystanders. You might know something doesn't feel right, or people aren't being treated fairly, but most people just kind of choose to sit back and watch to see how things play out, not get too involved. You might grumble and complain that, you know, but don't take any action. So that's something I really also wanted to highlight, in this story. Probably one of the main things, the power of reaching out to people in our communities that are targeted and dangerous, and see what we can do to help them out. So yeah, I just want to take another few minutes to talk about the power of working with these organizations. So as you can probably tell by now, I've learned a ton during the process of creating this book. As an artist, I'm usually here in my studio, just heads down, working, and by myself. And so when I reached out to the University of Washington and Densho for help, it added story, collaborating with the historians. Not only helped me make sure my, history was accurate and got my stories straight, but, provided inspiration for, allowing this project to grow. And it also created, these long-lasting relationships. So Devin Narr, who was the professor at University of Washington, he ended up writing the afterword for my book, which is a really fascinating piece of work about, the connection between the Sephardic, Jewish, and Japanese cultures, the parallels. And Densho, I continue to work with them on events and to stay educated. One of the other organizations that helped me was For Culture. And so For Culture is a arts and culture organization with funding workshops in Washington State. And so, I'm sure, for those who are not in Washington, these organizations exist all over the country. And I'd never applied for a grant before, but this really a really great experience. Helped me lay out a plan for the project and get initial feedback. And then I also hooked up with the Washington State Jewish Historical Society. So similar to Densho in that they have amazing archives and resources and events. So they were a great resource for my research. And so, yeah, there's a lot of other organizations that helped. This slide always cracks me up because it just kind of makes me look like I'm a professional researcher or something, but it's just far from the case. I just want to make it clear it's like this all happened by accident. So every person I talked to along the way, from Devin or all the way up through the process, helped by pointing me in a different direction for resources, and I just followed the leads and just kind of grew from there. So it was kind of a cool process. I also relied on conversations and feedback from local authors. These are some great books. Special shout out to Ken Mochizuki, who wrote Baseball Saved Us. And he ended up writing the foreword for We Are Not Strangers. And so that was a really cool connection. So yeah, along with all the help from, these organizations and professional writers, I just wanted to take a second to talk about the face-to-face conversations I had with people that added this project. So a lot of times in interviews, I'd hear people mention an important landmark, that I could incorporate into the background of one of my scenes, with the artwork. But sometimes my conversations with people would turn into like a completely whole new chapter. And so one example of this is I knew that the Sephardic Bechor Cholim synagogue was an important Seattle central landmark, but I didn't know what temple was like, back in the 40s. And so I asked around, and my mom's best friend had early childhood memories of going to synagogue. And she told us about the women's section in the balcony, where people would gossip and shush each other during the service while the rabbi was trying to speak. And so I used that as the foundation for one of my chapters. Another example of a conversation that led to a whole new chapter. We have a family friend, Linda Suyama, who owns the Azuma Gallery here in Seattle. Those in Seattle, if you're here, it's amazing Japanese fine art gallery. If you haven't been, you should definitely go down and check it out. Just right downtown. And so I went to visit the gallery, and I talked to Linda about my project, and she brought out these Japanese woodblock prints. And the prince became the focal point of this scene of a father teaching his daughter about their family origins. So the woodblock prints ended up being kind of a unique way for my characters to discuss their family history. Okay, so there's one more example I wanted to talk about. So I kept hearing about Link's Tackle Shop from people when I was interviewing them. And like, I talked to people from the old neighborhood, and they're like, you got to include something with Link's Tackle Shop. And so I know I'd always seen it. And so it was a Japanese American owned store in the Central District. And so as I got more into it, I thought this tackle shop would be a great setting for one of my scenes. So I got in touch with the owners, Jerry and Maria Beppu, who were nice enough to invite me to their house for an interview. And when I told them that my story was about highlighting people who, reached out to help their neighbors during the war, when they heard that, they both just kind of looked at each other and they smiled. And Jerry, went on to tell me about the story of his dad, who was an immigrant from Japan who struggled to make a living in Seattle. But before the war, his tackle shop was really starting to take off, and it was getting popular, and the family was feeling stable. And one day he took his family up for a day of skiing up here at Snoqualmie Pass. And when they drove back into Seattle, they found out that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And it wasn't long after that they were forced to close the tackle shop, and evacuate to the Puyallup Fairgrounds Assembly Center, where they'd be held for months before being put into permanent camps. And after years of living in the camps, the family returned home, and to their surprise, a Jewish insurance agent, friend of theirs, had continued to pay their insurance premiums while they were away. And when the policy matured, the family received a payout, and they were able to reopen Link's Tackle Shop. This insurance agent even checked up on the shop while they were away, stored supplies for them. This was, there's a lot more to the story, but I was able to record it and, put it on the Densho archive. But it was just a really cool moment. I went to interview these folks about just their shop and what it was like, and it just turned into another example of a story like this. So it was a pretty cool moment. But yeah, just another example of the kind of stories I would use to weave into my story to create this book. So so this book, in closing, this book has been out for a few months now. And I keep getting asked why I think these stories are so relevant today. And there's so many. But there's still a lot of ignorance and violence, as out there, as we see, unfortunately, in the news all the time here, which affects our communities right here in the Pacific Northwest. And sometimes it feels like the cycle of conflict will absolutely just never end. I know I'm not the only one that's felt, pretty much just hopeless this last few months. But these true stories of real people from different backgrounds working together and helping each other out during uncertain times. I think we can all agree that's something we need a lot more of these days. Sometimes it feels like we're almost encouraged to look at each other as strangers in the media and in other places. So I hope that the stories that I've highlighted in this book can act as a reminder that, it just doesn't have to be that way. So thank you very much. That's my talk. I guess kind of came up short of the 40 minutes, but
Thank you
if you
so
guys
much,
have any,
Josh.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, there are many questions and comments, and thank you so much for sharing with us the stories in your book and also your artwork and the process behind it. It was super interesting. And so I'll just read out a few questions, comments, thoughts that came in, and of course, I'm just speaking to the audience, but feel free to put more. We have a bit of time. We will try to answer as much as we can to many questions. And just to let you know, tomorrow we will send out an email which will include this recording. It will include links to where to buy the book, and also we will include some of the recommendations that Josh mentioned, that he used for his research, if you also want to find those books. So I just want to comment on some of the comments that came in, that a lot of people in the chat mentioned that they actually knew of camps where Japanese were taken, like in their area all over the US. And you also mentioned about these. So this is just a question that we were actually wondering about, that why do you think it's so unspoken of or still so unknown as a theme if it's like right there and people know about it?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. It is right there. But I think that we have a lot to learn as far as like especially in America, with people, our education system not willing to teach things that America made a mistake about. So I think that that's changing. It really does seem to be changing. I think that like in my kids go to high school here, and they definitely are learning about these things. But and one of the other big themes in my book is about how the fact a lot of people that I interviewed that grew up with family members who were either in the Holocaust or incarcerated in these camps, they didn't know a lot about what happened to their family, to their parents or their grandparents. And I think that's a lot of about, that's another similarity of these cultures about, protecting their kids from the truth and just working hard, moving forward, and and not trying to talk about bad things. But it's encouraging, I think, that people want to learn about that history, So I think that shows that, because I think that's a way that we can, heal from that kind of stuff. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah. I mean, it's a big question, so I'm sure there are
yeah.
more. It did. Thank you. Another question was that the Japanese Americans were massively put into internment camps, but the Germans weren't. And I don't know if this is something that came up in your research or anything that you've heard about this, like why this happened this way, even though there were many Nazi sympathizers among them.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of this history that I still actually have to learn. I know that Italians were taken into the camps. There were definitely other cultures that were removed from, stripped of their rights and put into camps. And yeah, I think, just the fact that not one person was ever found guilty of anything that they put in the camps of these thousands of people, obviously they were looking for ways to protect the the America, and so they were targeting these groups. And so yeah, Japanese Americans weren't the only ones, but um yeah, I definitely have heard about that history.
Thank you. Changing a bit the topic, more focusing on your book. Is your book in paperback and in libraries? That's the first question.
Oh
Simple.
yeah, so it just came out in hardcover, and it is in libraries, but it will be coming out in paperback, I think, at the end of this year. And so I think that'll be a little more accessible to more people. But yeah, the plan is for it to come out in paperback.
Thank you. And do you have a discussion guide for book groups? And would you want people from the audience to invite you to their book groups?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'm really excited about my publisher. Um, it just released an educational study guide for schools, but I think it would be a really great thing for a book club as well. And I can send you guys the link to include. But the educational guide is, I'm really excited about that because my goal with this project has always been to have this used in a educational setting. I don't know how it was for me growing up, learning history. My favorite things were like books where I really connected with the characters, and I was, just on the ride for the story, but I was learning history alongside of that. And so I really have hopes for that to happen. And it's already happening already with schools. And then, yeah, as far as book clubs, yeah, I would definitely reach out to me. I'm always open to that.
Thank you. So we will share your contact information, your email address with the audience, and then if
Sure.
someone wants to invite Josh, then
Real quick, I just want to say, for like education and book, for like people who are interested in book clubs, like all the information I learned along the way, I would, write down my notes about, all the stuff I was learning. And so when I got my publisher, they were like, oh, we should include those notes. So I have in the back matter, there's all this like glossary and resources of more information. So yeah, I think that would be a really cool thing for a book club or for education. So.
thank you. There was a question that you shared a lot of like photos and your artwork. Like in your book, is only the artwork, or do you also include some of the original photos or other type of images?
No, so everything in this story is either redrawn or, yeah, repurposed by me as an artistic representation. So yeah, that was kind of important to me just to kind of keep the theme going. But yeah, as you saw, I used a lot of resources for that. And it's good, makes me think I should probably put up something on my website that has more resources to some of the actual source material, but it's not included in the book, but it is as an illustration.
Thank you. Another question is, what are you working on now? And if you're working on something, is there anything with a Jewish theme?
Yeah, I'm working on a bunch of stuff. I've been getting this question a lot, and you know, when I first heard this story from my uncle, when he was cooking us dinner and told us the story, it was 4 years ago. Um, and it was one of those stories where you hear it and you're like, wow, I haven't heard anything like this, and I wanted to do something about it. And I didn't know it was going to take so many years to, develop the artwork, research, and all this stuff. And it was such a great experience, and I do want to do it again. But I have a lot of different project ideas, and I'm not sure which one it's going to be just because I have to know that I'm going to commit to that much of it's going to take that much time. But yeah, I'm definitely open to hearing more stories. That's one of the coolest parts of this experience has been, every time I do a talk or an event, there's so many people come up into me and tell me about a similar story or some sort of story, and I'm like, oh, that could be a whole graphic novel, just that story. So it's a long-winded story of I have no idea.
Great. So we'll have to keep a lookout. The
Yeah.
next question is, are you in a bus?
Oh, am I in a bus? Yes, I am. This is my art studio. When my kids were born, we have a small house here in the woods, and when I had kids, I was like, I'd leave my artwork out, it would get destroyed. Like it was just, I was like running out of space. And so me and my wife were brainstorming ideas, and then this bus popped up on a Craigslist ad for an old guy who wanted to drive it to Burning Man, if you know what the Burning Man Festival is. So anyway, I had it towed here, and it's just been my studio ever since. So that's the story.
Thank you. Back again a bit with the history questions. How long were they in camps, the Japanese Americans?
Yeah, so from the very first to the very end was about 4 years, a long time. And I have a lot more detail in the book about that and like what that looked like. And the public outcry, the public was pretty resistant to, even letting people out. And so that's one of the reasons that it did last so long. But yeah, it was a long enduring process.
Thank you. Back to you a little bit. Are you involved or connected with the Jewish Book Council?
Oh yeah. So my publisher is connected with them, and they did do a review. I'm considering applying for they have kind of a traveling book talk thing for authors, and I'm considering that. But yeah, I have been involved with them, and I hope to continue to.
Thank you. And have you done any talks for Japanese American communities organizations?
Yeah, I have. In partnership with Densho, there's been a couple things. I have a couple other things coming up. There's something coming up in Portland. But my favorite things have been kind of obviously in line with the story is when I've done events in like with a Holocaust education center and a Japanese historian center where we both do a combined event. So that those have just been so rewarding to just see that because the Japanese and Jewish community, connection here in the area is pretty unknown in a lot of parts of the world, but it's pretty strong here, and so that's just been a really, really cool thing to see, you know, those communities collide in around this story.
Thank you. What media do you use for the art? Is it watercolor?
Oh, yeah. So when I started the book, I did everything in pencil, and that's how I kind of started it. And I thought this was going to be a very small project that I could just kind of publish locally, maybe just as I talked about, I talked to people, it just kept growing and growing. I started using drawing on my iPad digitally, and as soon as I did that, I just never went back. I do everything digitally now. And as far as the color goes, when I submitted this book to my publisher, I always pictured it to be black and white. That's how I did the whole thing. But they really wanted to do it in color. And so we worked with a colorist, Avery Bacon, who did all her coloring online or on digitally actually. But it has a really rich texture to it that feels yeah, it does have a watercolor feel. So that's a good question. It's a good observation. But yeah, that's kind of the process.
Thank you. Were there any camps in Hawaii? Do you know about that?
I don't, no, I don't think so. But I think that there were assembly centers. I'd have to do, but I don't think there was official camps. And I have a list of those in the book as well, and a little bit more history there.
Thank you. Will the book be translated to Japanese?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I have no idea. That would be amazing. I do have there is some Ladino in the book because when I was growing up, my there was a little bit of Ladino spoke throughout my just little phrases here and there, so I wanted to incorporate that in. And Devin, the professor Nar, he's all about translating it to Ladino, and I have heard about that, but I think that comes down the road. But I don't know. I think that would be a really great experience to have it translated.
Thank you. What age would be appropriate for youth to read it?
Yeah, so I'm surprised. I thought, more like middle school on up to adult, and all the way up to, my grandparents and great grandparents' age. But I've been surprised when I've done some book talks at bookstores, and a little child who's a fifth grader comes up and talks to me about the book and all the history, and I'm always surprised. I think it really depends on the kid. I've run into a couple fourth, fifth graders that have really enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. So yeah, I think you'd have to just gauge your own capacity.
Thank you. What are bolemas?
Oh, so dilemmas and so my side of my mom's side of the family is from Greece. They call them barekas, and it's probably the best food in the world. So it's phyllo dough that's been soaked in oil overnight, and then it's kind of a pastry that you the cheese and bake in the oven. So it's kind of yeah, it's just like this kind of savory pastry.
Thank you. And if you provide recipes that of foods that appear in the book, that was the next question.
Oh my gosh, I wanted to, but it got nixed. But I was like, can we put a dilemma recipe? But I don't know. Yeah, I think you can look it up for sure. There are recipes online. Yeah.
Okay. And uh, and actually, we got a comment from someone who is from Hawaii, and she says that there was a camp on Oahu that is in the
Okay.
process of restoration as a National Park Service site. So thank you for this information. And I also just
That's
want to
great.
tell everyone who commented, I see that a lot of valuable resources have been shared in the chat about books that are related to the topic or other sources that people can research about this theme. So we're going to collect them from the chat, and we're going to include also these resources in tomorrow's follow-up email, so you can all browse through calmly this crowdsourced information that we just received. So thank you very much for that. And I just also want to tell you, Josh, that there was a lot of comments also about how great the story is and how great the book is, and many people are already planning to buy it or get it to their libraries or their book clubs. So hopefully all these connections will be made, and I hope many people will read your book. I don't see now more questions. I hope I managed to more or less ask everything that people had on their minds. Thank you so much for this huge variety of questions as well. So I think we're going to close for today. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, we will share Josh's email address also in the follow-up email. Many people were asking about that as well, so that's why I'm mentioning. So if someone wants to invite him or get in touch, then you will have the opportunity. So I'll just pass the closing word back to Josh, and then we will close for today.
That's great. Thank you so much. Also, yeah, thank you for connecting me with, I've been able to keep up with the chat, so it'd be great to continue to connect with people, because like I said, that's been probably the most rewarding part of this project, is to connect with people around this story during the process of creating it and then also after. So thank you so much for the encouragement and for the for all the great questions and insights, and really, really great. I'm also really excited to discover Qesher so that I can, I can see some other events and authors. So it's been really great to meet you all.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everybody. This week, I just want to let you know that we will have 2 more talks. On Thursday, we will have a talk about the Jews of Argentina, and on Sunday about the Jewish history of Dublin and Ireland. So you are welcome to join us then. And in about 1 month, in 4 weeks, we will have our next book club session, which will be also about a Sephardic theme. It's called the Turkish Sephardic Patriot. So you can also join us then. It's going to be also a very interesting event. But we will also share all of this with you in tomorrow's follow-up email. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being here. And we hope to see you soon. And have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
a lot. Thank you. Very interesting.
Really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.